The rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States began shortly after World War II because of the influence of communism the Soviet Union had on Eastern Europe and the disagreement about reconstructing Germany. On October 16, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis became the closest these two sides came to nuclear warfare. The U.S. reacted with the aiming of nuclear weapons from Turkey at Cuba. The Cold War ended the spread of communism and stopped the tragedy of bombing the U.S.
After the war, many countries tried to help rebuild Germany. The Potsdam Conference favored economically dividing Germany. They divided Germany into 4 economic zones. Germany was ruled by many countries. The east side was ruled by the Soviets and the west side was ruled by the Americans, British, and French. The powers failed to do what the conference wanted, though, and began to pursue their own interests. The Russians and the Americans wanted Germany to pursue the different things, thus creating the Berlin Wall.
The Soviet Union started the spread of communism in most of Eastern Europe and turned the east side of Germany into a communist government.
The Bay of Pigs invasion occurred on April of 1961. The Americans led 1,400 American trained Cubans into
Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. The United States surrendered after less than a day of fighting, and afterwards Castro teamed up with the Soviet Union. He asked the Soviet Union to bring weapons, soldiers, and advisors. The Soviet Union did this because they knew that there were nuclear missiles in Eastern Europe and Turkey, so they needed to do something. On the 16th, Kennedy received these pictures. And shortly after had a talk about what to do with the Soviets. He had the Joint Chief of Staff, leaders of the U.S. Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force, help him come up with a non-military action of a blockade. On October 18th, Kennedy met with Soviet Foreign Minister to talk about the missiles. He said that they were just defensive missiles. On October 20th, Kennedy was sure he was going to blockade Cuba. He called his plan a quarantine. On the 22nd, after Kennedy announced the situation to the public, he sent a letter to Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to dismantle missiles. He would remove the missiles only if the United States would not invade Cuba. Khrushchev still ordered the ships to keep coming with missiles. On October 24th, the U.S. ordered a blockade on Cuba, stopping the ships and making Khrushchev remove missiles. Secretly later, the Americans also removed their missiles from Turkey. A few months after the Bay of Pigs invasion, Cuban leader Fidel Castro was in need of protection. The CIA and U.S. State Department tried to push him from power 2 years before the Bay of Pigs invasion. He needed some protection in case there was another invasion from the U.S. He asked the Soviet Union to help take on the United States on December of 1961. Castro obligated the Soviets to protect his socialist organization. He asked the Soviets for weapons, advisors, and Soviet soldiers. The Soviets proposed to bring medium-range ballistic missiles. Castro agreed and they were started building missiles in the summer of 1962. When John F. Kennedy received over 900 pictures, the Soviet Union assured him the missiles were just for defense. They could have used military action, but on October 20th, they announced that they were going to blockade Cuba. On October 22nd, Kennedy told the public that the Soviet Union was planting nuclear missiles just 90 miles off the U.S. coast.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The public was stunned. That same night, John sent a letter to Nikita Khrushchev demanding the removal of the missiles. Khrushchev said the missiles were to protect Cuba and the ships wouldn't turn back. On October 24th, the United States sent U.S. ships to blockade Cuba. They stopped many ships carrying nuclear weapons and made them turn around. On October 28th, Nikita Khrushchev announced to the public that he would remove missiles from Cuba if the U.S. did not invade Cuba. They agreed to not invade Cuba, and under surveillance of the United Nations, the Soviets dismantled missiles. The removal of the missiles lasted until November 20th. In April of 1963, the United States used submarines to secretly remove the missiles from Turkey. So far, there were 100 tactical nuclear warheads already there in Cuba. Many events took place during this 45-long-year war between the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. After the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, the United States dismantled their nuclear missiles in Turkey and because they weren't being held at Europe. The Soviet Union also shot down an American U-2 plane. This was one of the 2 casualties that occurred in the Cuban Missile Crisis. When John F. Kennedy sent a naval blockade around Cuba, he prevented the Soviet Union from placing armed missiles 90 miles off the coast of the U.S. The Berlin Wall was also taken down because the United States stopping communism in the Eastern government. The spread of communism in Europe, Asia, and Africa had been put to an end due to the falling out of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Soviet Union was forced to dismantle missiles. The unintended consequence of letting missiles into Cuba unnoticed led the 2 countries being at the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis influenced the fall of the Berlin Wall, which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and eventually the end of the spread of communism. Also, it stopped nuclear warfare from ever breaking out, which would have led to the entire part of the Northern Hemisphere being wiped out. It also helped create the United Nations, which helps us stop communism today. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides agreed to limit their nuclear weapons. This led to all countries coming to an agreement on reducing all of their nuclear weapons. Relations between Cuba and Russia was shaky afterwards. Cuba accused them of backing out and leaving them stranded. Looking back at it, the Cuban Missile Crisis convinced an already paranoid public that the communists were on their doorstep. The Cold War was a lot of chest-pounding and name-calling. There was not a lot of action. The Cuban Missile Crisis, on the other hand, made it seem real.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.